Good afternoon. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Monterey County, our November Lunch and Learn meeting. What do you think of your lunch today might be GMO food? I would now like to turn the program over to Patty Fashing, who is the chair of our Agricultural Study Committee, and she has arranged for today's speaker, and I'm sure she has some things to tell you about ag study.
Hi, everybody. I just want to remind you that our first planning meeting for the Ag Study will be December 4th at 4:30 p.m. in the Villa Serra Executive Dining Room. Now I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is the second speaker that we've had to speak on agriculture so far. His name is Dr. Zahi Atallah, and he was born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon. And as he was growing up, he was really involved in agriculture. Then he got his bachelor's degree in agricultural engineering at Holy Spirit University in Lebanon, then went on to get a master's in plant pathology at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, then got a PhD at Washington State University in Pullman, in plant pathology, right? Okay, well, and then between 2003 2011, he worked as a vegetable plant pathology scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the University of California, Davis. His areas of expertise are population genetics, disease epidemiology, and fungal molecular biology. And now he currently works as he's the Dean of Advanced Technology at Hartnell College, where he oversees the instruction and facilities at the Alisal campus.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you for having me here today. As Patty mentioned, in a previous life, I used to be a scientist dealing with agriculture. And my presentation to you today is not from a militant standpoint. It's a presentation from a scientific standpoint about how I understand agriculture, genetically modified organisms that are consumed or otherwise. And I'm trying to inform you from the way I see it. And the way I see agriculture is perhaps a little bit different. I grew up in the third world. I grew up where not having food means you starve to death, or you can't afford food. Food is a major issue for my people. I was lucky. My grandpa was one of the largest landowners. I had a problem growing up, a pretty good one. When he died, I inherited a large portion of his orchards and fields. Why is it a problem? It's because I was 9 years old and I had to tend to it. It's a good problem when you're handed something you haven't worked for. So I grew up literally knee-high to a grasshopper, learning how to farm, learning what it means to produce a crop, to pay for the box that you put the peaches in, or to produce enough to repay for the sprays on the potatoes, so on and so forth. So I grew up doing field crops, predominantly potato and corn and wheat. I had lots of peach trees in the thousands, lots of grapevines, also in the thousands. Also lots of animals, and whether it be cows and sheep and goats and in the hundreds for each, and 500,000 chickens and honeybees. So I've done it all, practically. I haven't raised fish. And my favorite philosopher happens to be a green person, Kermit the Frog. And I like what he said. It's not that easy being green. We all consume foods that are produced by agriculture. We're all wearing clothes, fiber that has come from agriculture. The tires on our cars come from latex. Many of the cars have cotton fibers in them, and so on and so forth. So agriculture is everywhere. Most of the glue in your tables is a soybean-produced glue. Lots of cars take ethanol blended alcohol. Well, ethanol is coming from predominantly corn in the US and sugarcane in other places and sugar beet in more places. I do have a couple of disclaimers. For my presentation, I don't want you to take get the opinion that I've been ever paid or I'm currently paid by any for-profit company, whatever its name is, listed on NASDAQ, on New York Stock Exchange or any exchange. I've never owned any stock in any company, nor have I been paid by any non-profit organization. I work currently at Hartnell College. Prior to that, I worked in land-grant universities. Just wanted to put it out there, my perspective, take it with a grain of salt, it's my own. With that, another disclaimer. What I say today is my personal perspective, not that of Hartnell College, nor its board of trustees. Just, I don't want to get canned, okay? I want to make sure you all know that. And another thing, I've stolen most of the pictures that you'll see. Okay? So, I thank everybody. If it's you, thank you. If it's somebody else, sorry, they missed out on it. Anyway, let's talk in particular about the Salinas Valley. Salinas Valley is one of the most productive valleys in California. It's not too far from here. It's predominantly known for this young, well, who was then a young man, Steinbeck, but also for some greeneries. Those are not in the Salinas Valley, in Monterey County. And the otter out in the ocean and Pebble Beach and whatnot. But people forget that Monterey County produces over $8 billion worth of agricultural produce. Not a penny or two, 8.2 billion. That's larger than the GDP of my country, which is, by the way, the same size as this county. Over 50% of every head of lettuce produced in North America comes from this small valley, less than 100 miles long by 20 to 30 miles at its widest. An equally high amount of the strawberries are produced in the Salinas Valley. Most of the spinach you buy is produced in the Salinas Valley. People don't necessarily know that. Outside of Monterey County, you say, where's the lettuce produced? I don't know, Safeway? Now, there are some names that are recognized the world over. I grew up eating Driscoll's berries. Dole is an internationally famous name, and Green Giant, and so on and so forth. When it comes to their leafy greens and berries, their headquarters are either Salinas or Watsonville. Watsonville is not quite Monterey County, but they're just across that small trickle of a river. And again, their production is sold the world over. You can go to Japan and buy blueberries from Driscoll's. You can go to southern Mexico and buy a bag of lettuce from, let's say, Taylor or Fresh Express or whoever. Overall, in the US, agriculture is not just a big business, it's a humongous business. 18 companies are listed in the Fortune 500 that are directly involved in agriculture. We're not talking about Philip Morris who owns a food production company. We're talking about direct revenue coming from ag. Those could be fertilizer companies, those could be tractor companies, those could be straight ag production companies. You know, I'm thinking about the John Deere, a Caterpillar, a Tridenial Midlands, Cargill, Monsanto, you name whatever company you'd like, you name them.
Are wine grapes?
Are wine grapes. None of the largest companies are wine grape producing companies. They're a little small in comparison to the big behemoth. But in Monterey County, quite a bit of production happens. We're the third largest production area in the state of California. It's still worth $600 million out of the revenue. And some of those companies down here are in the wine production, the largest of which would be Constellation Wines, which is a South African company. It's a conglomerate. They own wineries the world over, and they have a large production in the southern part of the Salinas Valley. So again, for the US, agriculture is huge. And we'll talk a little bit about why it is huge. But let's look first at the dollars. Those are the 10 states that export most agricultural products. California is by far the largest. But notice that the total value for the year 2010 was $115 billion. This is just exports. Those are the foods, the fibers, the fuels that were not consumed within the confines of this country. The number is staggering. Needless to say, when you see that the second largest exporting state is Iowa and Illinois.
I was going to ask, what do those central states export?
The question was, what do the central states produce? Corn and soybean, soybean and corn, soy corn. I mean, in all fairness, they do produce a lot more. The major crops are, in terms of dollar value, would be corn and soybean. But there are huge productions of hay. If you look at Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and Illinois, lots of hay is produced there. But the value of hay is minimal. Also, just another side note, there's a lot of production of potato. Wisconsin is the third largest potato producer. North Dakota is the fourth. Minnesota is the fifth. What else?
Wheat?
Sure, absolutely. Wheat, huge amount of wheat. Yes?
Is there any country in the world that refused to take our GMO modified corn and soy? Or they all import?
The question was, do all countries accept, foreign countries accept the GMO soybean, corn, cotton, whatever? The question is, all European Union countries do not take for human consumption any of those products.
But for the animal feeds?
For animal feed, for production of oils and other things, they do buy them. And the U.S. is the world's largest exporter of soy and corn, although it competes pretty closely every year with Brazil and Argentina. The market in terms of exports, because the market in the U.S. is pretty large compared with what it is in Argentina and Brazil. And they all produce GMO crops. Let's talk a little bit about agriculture. Agriculture for me is all about people and machines. Or it used to be more about people, less about machines. Now it's more about machines and less about people. If we look at this graph up here, on this vertical axis on the left, this is the number of farms in the thousands that were in the U.S. And those are the years on the horizontal axis, starting at the beginning of the 20th century, ending at the beginning of the 21st century. And on that vertical axis on the right, it's the size of the farm as acres. And you're going to see that there's an extreme reduction in the number of farms, but an increase in the number of acres of an individual farm. And basically, more and more people left farming to become city dwellers, working in other industries, and whoever stayed back, in order for them to make a decent living, they had to expand the size of their farm. To give you an example, if you go to Washington State, Eastern Washington is pretty darn dry. In order to make a living producing wheat and lentils, you need a minimum of 5,000 acres. And that's a bare minimum. Well, the price of an acre is not as high as it is here, but still, it's a fortune. And they barely make a living. It's rain-fed. You can literally pitch a tent and put a camel and call it Saudi Arabia in certain places. It's that dry. So we've also seen it all over the U.S. where you'd have the family dairy farm with 10 heads of dairy, and now you hardly ever find it. If you have 1,000 heads of dairy, you're a small farmer basically. Not quite 1,000. I would say 500 would be a small farmer. Let's look at historical trends. In the U.S. in the 1870s, 80% of the population lived and worked on farms. In 2010, it was less than 2%. Therefore, it does not appear as an option in the census. Too small. Now, if you look at the Salinas Valley, you think almost everybody works in agriculture. But this is a small microcosm because of what we grow and because the need for labor. But if you go to, let's go back to the Midwest, Joey can be driving a combine for hours and hours by himself. So what has driven those numbers down? Predominantly, it's the mechanization. So we see fewer and fewer of the Jose's and Maria carrying, those are transplants of celery. We'll see fewer and fewer of those, and we'll see stuff drilled using equipment. In our area, the fields are too small for us to be able to do that economically with all the technologies that we have, which are lagging behind. Small fields make it really hard to develop technologies that would allow us to heavily mechanize. Plus, if we heavily mechanize, what's going to happen to the thousands of people who toil every single day from before sunrise till way after sunset so I can have a salad every day of the week? Which, by the way, is not that natural. You know, having berries for Christmas is not how it used to be 100 years ago. But because it's a business and we are all consumers and we want to eat healthy, we want to be better, we have forced the industry to adapt. Well, they were very happy because they were making money. One of the things that people forget is that women are at the core of agriculture. And you notice I said Joey was driving a combine. In most cases, yes, it's a Joey who's a football-loving, machist guy who's driving a combine, but we forget that women have historically and still currently been at the center of agriculture. In the Middle East, where I come from, the man used to go and grow the grain crops. The women used to grow not just the flowers around the house, but all the veggies, all the fruits. And in many instances, used to brew the beer, the wine, and get the honey from the honeybee hives. So to claim that agriculture is a man's fiefdom is really missing the point. And I'm not trying to be nice because most of you in this room are women, but it's a reality. One of the biggest names in science is Barbara McClintock. There's even a stamp. I mean, when it was 37 cents, so it's a few years ago. Barbara McClintock won the Nobel Prize for medicine, in this case, although she was never involved in medicine. She's a geneticist, a plant geneticist. She faced sexism, because she's a woman, she couldn't be as bright as a man. We just had this conversation. Therefore, whatever she would have thought or discovered was eh. But she proved everybody wrong. What she has discovered is something very simple. Well, to her it was simple. The reason why we've got Indian corn with all those various colors for each of the kernels is because there is a portion of that DNA that jumps around. It's called transposable element, transposons. They jump around in the genome, they disrupt certain genes, and if luck is that they land in a gene that codes for a certain color and they disrupt it, you end up with a different color. This is a major discovery because transposable elements make up about 30% of our human genome, and they have been connected with a variety of different illnesses, but also resistances to a variety of different illnesses. So this is why she received the Nobel Prize. And she was kicked out of Cornell University because she never got a position there because why? She did not have the Y chromosome. Which, by the way, is much smaller than the X chromosome. So, other female heroes that we forget about are women out in the field today, at this hour, picking the berries and the fruits and the salads that you and I are having. Management. This is an example. Patricia Wirtz is the CEO of Archer Daniel Midland, one of the largest world conglomerates. They used to be housed in Decatur, Illinois. Now they're moving to somewhere in the suburbs of Chicago. nonetheless, they're in Flatland, Illinois. She rules over a fiefdom of God knows how many tens of thousands of people. Their products, every one of us has consumed, whether it be in some kind of a flour, some kind of an oil, some kind of a fiber or fertilizer or otherwise. Agriculture is also at the center of many sciences. Many of you may remember that Gregor Mendel, who's considered to be the father of genetics, didn't look at genetics in pigs or humans, it was in peas. Guess what? Peas happens to be a plant. It still happens to be a plant that we produce and consume quite a bit today. This gentleman here is Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher is the person who happened to work at a rinky-dinky place called Cambridge University in the UK. Teeny tiny place. And he's the guy he's considered to be the father of statistics. And where did he work? He worked at Rothamsted Farms, which is the farm of Cambridge University. And he needed to figure out which of his plots were better than the others. So he came up with what is today statistics. Whether it is the statistics that's used on TV to tell us who won the electoral votes, or it is the one that predicts the weather, agriculture spurred his invention of statistics. Now, one of the first genomes, entire genomes, DNA genomes, to have been entirely sequenced, published, and released happens to be that of a plant. It's called Arabidopsis. Nobody grows Arabidopsis. It's a weed off the side of the road. It has a small genome, and it was a battle in the 1960s and 70s whether it's going to be tomato or Arabidopsis. There were more Arabidopsis fans than tomatoes, so they sequenced Arabidopsis. And that was the first flowering plant. And it's one of the first genomes. It preceded by several years the human genome and many other genomes that have come since then. Logistics. Every time you harvest a crop, you need to cool it, you need to move it, you need to ship it, you need to bag it, you need to do anything with it. Logistics have to come in. And agricultural logistics was the reason why we had logistics. Marketing. Well, it's nice to harvest the crop, but if you can't sell it, it's an issue. So agriculture is at the center of many scientific advancements. Now, I'm not stealing from anybody here. Those are my own slides that I produced when I used to be a scientist, again, in a previous life. Agriculture is at the intersection of various sciences. This here, although it doesn't really show it, this is a three-dimensional distribution of pathogens within a potato field in the soil. So a grower knows that there is a disease on his plants. And by the way, yes, plants do get disease, similar to humans. Now, most of our diseases are bacterial and viral. Most of plant diseases are fungal in nature, but then there are bacteria and fungi and other things. So let's say the grower wants to grow a crop of potatoes. The only way he or she would know that there is a disease in the field, or pathogen I should say, would be to see the disease. Well, it's too late if they've lost a portion of their crop. So I developed a statistical model based on sampling, and this information I had to use some mathematical modeling that came out of all places, AT&T Bell Labs, where they developed a statistical model, a mathematical model, to see how they can reroute across all of their, that dates back to the 1950s, across all of their cables, they can reroute the communications. Mother's Day is still a huge day for them, and if they use the typical east-west going cables, they'd fill up pretty quickly. But they had to reroute going through Canada, so they had to figure out a model, and I put it in there. So we had to use statistics, we had to use mathematics, we had to use molecular biology, we had to use lots of genomics and combinatorial chemistry in order to build this information for an agricultural purpose. Now, if we look at those two graphs, this is looking at the fungus that's an affliction of our lettuces in the Salinas Valley that propped up in the last 20 years. And using some genome sequencing, we were able to identify that we have two main populations in the Salinas Valley. This is what we call a tree. One population is older than the other one, and this is On this axis here is time. Time starts here, 0 starts here, and this goes back in time. We identified that we had two populations, one of which goes back all the way to about 650,000 years ago. So, 650,000 years ago, yes. Just like yesterday. Agriculture is also a weapon. It's a weapon of war, it's a weapon of peace. Any of you who have Irish ancestry here? Quite a few. Why did your grandparents end up in this country? Potato famine. Potato famine, it's a good name. At the same time, it's not necessarily the most accurate name. And I'll tell you why. The pathogen that caused the potato famine is still the most predominant pathogen of potatoes and tomatoes today. Just last week, read a report from Wisconsin that they lost the equivalent of $50 million because of that disease, and that's one state. But what happened was that potatoes, if you didn't know it, potatoes were originally from this continent, and they were shipped to Europe. It took them about 100 years to start consuming them, but the Irish figured out that for them to be able to survive with their pretty large families, they needed to grow a crop that's going to fill the belly. So a typical man would consume up to 8 pounds of potatoes every day. A typical woman would consume up to 6 pounds of potatoes every day. They could grow potatoes on a small plot, but because they were predominantly Catholic, they couldn't own the land. The land was owned by the king or the queen of England. So they had to lease the land, and in order for them to pay the lease, they had to grow cereal that the British would eat in their biscuits. And the biscuit in the UK is a little bit different than the biscuit we know here. Of course, it's not as fancy as theirs. So what happened is that the potatoes came from this continent, so did the diseases of potatoes. In 1845, 1846, and 1847 were pretty wet springs. The pathogen loves moist, damp, cool conditions. Wiped out the fields, wiped out the production. Whatever potato seeds they thought they were keeping rotted in their bins before they were able to plant it the subsequent year. You can sustain yourself on little food for some time before diseases wipe you out. So many people, and by the way, the wheat that they were growing for the British, they had to sell it to the British because the British did not say, okay, you can keep the wheat to survive. They said, give me my stuff. Not quite with this accent, but anyway. So over 2 or 3 years, that's what happened. And this is why the population of Ireland was divided in two. And they haven't yet reached the numbers they had in the 1840s. And this is why more than 1 million Irish immigrated to this country. So, why am I calling it a weapon? Is because the British wanted a weaker Irish group. So they didn't let them eat the wheat, because if they ate the wheat, they'd be stronger and they could fight them, and that's not what they wanted. It's also a weapon of peace. Overtures to North Korea not too long ago were made with shipments of wheat flour. Going back to a weapon, both the US and the Soviet Union developed means and ways to wipe out the agricultural production of the opponents. And they happened to be diseases. There was actually at Fort Detrick in Maryland an arm of the US Army that was specializing in developing and weaponizing diseases and pathogens of plants. Then they closed it in, I think, the late 60s and transferred it to the USDA-ARS. It is a political tool. And talking about pests, people think that pests are localized. No, they don't. They're globetrotters, literally. 2 examples. If we look at the upper map of the US, it shows how rust of wheat, stem rust of wheat, is distributed every single year. It survives in northern Mexico. where it's warm enough that they can have a production during the winter months. And it travels with the prevailing winds all the way across the U.S. into the Canadian plains. Every single year. Goes up, dies off, goes up again the subsequent year. Doesn't stop at the border, it doesn't get checked, no passport, no travel information. Another even more unique situation was the soybean rust. Soybean rust somehow ended up landing in South America, in Brazil. They think it was an importation from Taiwan in some soybean trial seed that they brought in. That was in the 70s, ended up making its way north to Venezuela and Colombia. And here comes, in 2005, Hurricane Ivan. Sweeps through the coast of Venezuela. Did not just pick up roofs and houses and trees, it picked up soybean rust. Across the Caribbean Sea, into Mississippi and Louisiana, and boom, they found it on kudzu and soybean plots in both Mississippi and Louisiana. And your tax dollars went to few fellow researchers, colleagues of mine who became very famous trying to predict what's going to happen to the crop in the Midwest. Because most of the production in the U.S. of soybean and corn happens in the northern Great Plains, but also some of it happens in the southern states. So billions and billions of dollars were spent on trying to predict what's going to happen. Of course, this is after 2001 and all the scares and bioterrorism. 10 years later, soybean rust is nowhere to be seen in the upper Midwest. But pathogens and insects are also carried on equipment. They're also carried on personnel, boots, hair, pants, knives, gloves. They carry lots and lots of insects and diseases and pathogens. A typical example would be tobacco mosaic virus. Can go from the smoke to any plant. So one common thing in my neck of the woods is almost everybody smokes. In a greenhouse where they produce tomatoes, Joey goes in with his cigarette, plays with the plants, goes out a few days later, all the plants come down with tomato mosaic virus. And they wonder where it came from. Well, it came from that cigarette, not just his lung cancer, but their crop. Pathogens are also transferred by water. There are numerous studies that have shown that a lot of pathogens are more concentrated if they're irrigating a field. It's more concentrated at the beginning of the field where the water has come in than it is at the end. But guess what? Over time, with all the irrigations that we have, it'll spread evenly across the entire field. Also across rivers, long distance. Many pathogens were followed from the beginnings of the Nile to the Mediterranean Sea, and that's quite a long river, as you all know. And many pathogens are vectored by other pathogens and other insects, predominantly viruses and bacteria. So they do find a way to hitch a ride. So if it's not with the tractor or on boots, it's with another organism. So we do have lots of challenges, and we have quite a few opportunities. We have a growing population. We're expected to hit 9 to 10 billions in the next 20 years, 25 years. We have shrinking resources. We can't grow plants everywhere. We can't grow all the plants everywhere. And therefore, we need more arable land. We need more water. But I want to also play golf, wash my car, wear clean clothes. So they won't have enough water to do their agricultural production. So we're going to see more and more of this and fewer of this. This was actually a picture that a friend of mine took in Washington State. This is known as the 300 Circle Farm. They actually had over 700. And what that is an overhead pivot. The pump is at the center. Yes, ma'am?
With the shrinking resource of water in agriculture and in every field, is there any movement to try to measure how much water we use in agriculture? Because I know that a lot of the pump water from wells and they are not measuring their intake?
Lovely question. So the question was with regard to water. Part of the deal is to know how much water is being pumped out, and subsequently how much is being used. I presume, therefore, if there are any savings that could be made. It depends on the area. It depends on, between quotation marks, how progressive a grower is, which is bizarre. You'd suspect the most conservative to be wanting, I mean, the bean counting people to be counting the number of drops of water they put in, but it's the other way around. They want their tap to be open 24/7. When I dealt with the potato crop, we knew pretty closely how much water we were putting in. We were shaping the beds. We were spreading the plants based on our water availability, the water consumption, and we're trying to prevent the use of extra water. Why would that be? Extra water is not just a loss of water, which is a non-renewable resource. It's also a good way to leach away from the root zone all the nitrates and most of the other fertilizers that we're putting in for the plants to consume. So whatever we're putting, we're losing it simply because we're washing it down. You would think people would want to do something about that, but obviously they put more. That's the solution. Another thing is that more water means that soil is saturated, less air for the roots, therefore more rotting of the roots by diseases. But the solution is, oh, what the heck, I'll grow another 10 acres. If I lose 10%, I'm already up anyway. So the solutions are not necessarily based on science, they're based on, if they don't come after me, why should I care? And that's our problem, that laissez-faire attitude, that it's not my problem, my water is clean here, downstream, I couldn't care less. They can grow a third arm, it's not my child. That education, regulations, kick in the shins, punch in the face, and other approaches will help greatly. But if we have people who don't want to hear, don't want to read, we'll keep, and they have money and they can lobby. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you have a challenge there is increasing regulations. Where are regulations increasing to? Many of us, it seems like regulations are just disappearing. All the public safety and pesticide danger, fracking, everything is just going away. If we want regulations, we have to fight tooth and nail as the public.
The opinion is that we have fewer and fewer regulations, and where are regulations going? Lovely question. I do have to say, we would still have DDT were there not to be regulations that limited DDT. We would still have been washing crops with sewer.
50s or 60s, I'm talking about now.
Now we have more regulation than ever before, especially when it comes to using water. The water board, well, fracking has little to do with agriculture. It's a different process. So the water board has an agricultural, an urban, as well as an industrial area of coverage, and therefore they are dealing with fracking. None of the producers of crops in the Salinas Valley is necessarily happy to take their water away for me to wash my car or play golf in a parched desert on a beautifully manicured golf course. If we want to start talking, we need to look at Las Vegas and Palm Springs and Phoenix that should not have been there, and everybody wants to have a pretty nice lawn in front of their house. We have to make decisions, and there may not be enough regulations. I'm not going to disagree with you at all about it. I'm actually for regulation. Yes?
The causes of the Dust Bowl and the trees and the grasshoppers, and have we learned anything from that?
We'd hope. The question was the cause of the Dust Bowl in the 30s and the grasshoppers and the loss of topsoil. And Basically, the prairies were not supposed to be plowed. The prairies were supposed to be what their name indicates, just pastures. We made sure to plow them to plant predominantly wheat. And when we plowed them and the wind picked up, it picked up the topsoil, and we ended up with what happened in the 1930s and tens of thousands of people having to uproot their families and go west, wherever that west was. Or have we learned? Yes, the United States Department of Agriculture created the National, what is it? Nature Conservation Resource Service, NCRS, that specializes in studying that and trying to educate and prevent it. One of the main things that they did was to talk about creating windbreakers, which are no more than trees that are planted at a certain distance, preventing that wind from picking up speed. And they do work. For every meter of height, you get 10 meters of protection. Now, you come here, we don't do that, and if there were windbreaks, we made sure to chop them down because we want to have easy access to our tractors. So, unless we get a dust bowl in California, it's unlikely that we would have learned the lesson. But in many other states, they have incentives to keep those windbreaks and put more of them. So have we learned the lesson? Yes and no. We've learned bad lessons because of it. We brought in kudzu because supposedly it holds the ground, and now kudzu has overgrown most areas in the southern U.S. So we learn some. I wish we would learn a lot. We learn some, and we forget that we need to learn more. So quickly to go to the question of GMOs, what are the needs? More cheap food, beverage, and fiber, more nutritious food, and being rational about the use of our sources and resources, therefore sustainability should be something we think about. Sustainability isn't necessarily a tree-hugging, Birkenstock-wearing Santa Cruz person. It could be a cowboyish NRA member from the Salinas Valley. They're not mutually exclusive. Unfortunately, some people seem to think that it is not necessarily identical. And I would challenge anybody, wherever they land on the political spectrum, would you want your children to have food? Would you want them to live in an area where they can breathe and drink healthy air and water? They all say yes. Unfortunately, some of them believe that no need to change the way we operate. And needless to say, education to the consumer, education to the producer are necessary. And the more we slash cooperative extension in every state, the fewer educators farmers are going to find. The only education they will be getting would be in the pamphlets of the big Fortune 500 companies, which are basically selling them a product. We all love organics. I just wanted to clarify, and this is not my information, although I'm just plagiarizing it. Well, between quotation marks, it's not quite plagiarism. From UC Berkeley, and if you go to Wikipedia, if you like it, you'll find that organic agriculture doesn't necessarily mean it is pesticide-free. Ask any organic grower, they spray stuff. They drench their soils with stuff. And what many growers like are the copper products. And copper is one of the most toxic, if not the most toxic, compound that is present in the environment. So even organic agriculture requires more research and more education to the producers. And we're fighting many battles. So let's delve into a little bit about genetics of plants so we get to the genetic modifications that many of you are wondering about. If you look at this upper picture here, this is where the ancestors of the Mayans and the Aztecs used to have in their areas, is teosinte. It's the direct ancestor of the corn we know. If you look at the quarter, this is the size of the ear of teosinte that contains seed that is not edible. This is the size of a corn ear as we know it today. This did not come like that from the almighty creator or, through some random event, whatever your beliefs are. That was induced by humans. by breeding and selection. The wheat that we all eat is not what it used to be before about 10,000 years ago. My ancestors in the Middle East took wheat from a diploid, which is like us, 2 copies of each chromosome, to a tetraploid, 4 copies of each chromosome, and a hexaploid. The tetraploid is your soft wheat that goes into your bread. The hexaploid is the hard wheat that goes into your cookies and pasta. Those were done by humans. This was done by humans. Every corn plant that we have today is a mixture of 2 parents that are short to get, well, and it's laughable, but it's the reality. We call it the F1 hybrid power. And by the way they produce seed is, and same for production of ear corns, they would have 20 rows to 30 rows of females and 1 row of males. And they would detassel the females, so they would only be taking the pollen from the males. And that sexual recombination takes literally 2 short individuals, turns them into a super powerful, not quite tattooed, but bigger crop. So very few of the plants that we know today are the way they were before we started doing agriculture, doing selection, and doing breeding. Breeding sounds like a bad word. That's what puts food on the table of Patty Fashing. They develop melons and watermelons or just melons? Melons and lettuce, not by taking freaky individuals, but by looking at varieties and species of lettuce and trying to cross them so we can produce a very healthy plant that's going to resist diseases and insects. Why is that important? Because that will save us from having to spray pesticides. That will save us from having to lose crops and jack up the price of that bag of lettuce at the grocery store and consume more water. So, breeding, yes ma'am.
I was going to make a comment.
Please do.
That the breedings make some of the agricultural plants strong, but all good things come to a point where it becomes harmful. And the way we are breeding, we are reducing the varieties of crops, and therefore they are more susceptible to being wiped out and without any recourse. And that's why we have to put in even more insecticide or more whatever. And second thing that what I heard is this: we are producing 1.5 times the food needed by the current population. So it's not a matter that we need to produce more. We already have plenty. It's how to get this surplus, plenty, to those in need.
Yeah, first of all, it is not agriculture, but the fact that we produce 1.5 times what we need, what are we doing with that surplus? We cannot hoard anything that is agriculture for an extended period of time. It's going to rot. Or it's going to go bad in any other way. So I'm not necessarily convinced that this is true. Moreover, with regard to and I heard size over there, I don't believe it is true. And, well, that's fine. Who would want their produce to rot in front of their eyes and not be able to sell it and make a profit on it? That's why would they want to lose money right there and not make a profit on it? Companies want to sell everything they could. Now, with regard to more breeding, you reach a plateau, I'm going to leave it to a breeder. But they have very little evidence that the breeding we're doing today has reached any plateau. And the reason why we do the breeding is not to use more insecticides or pesticides in general. It is to try to reduce that It's quite the opposite. Patty, do you breed to increase the use of pesticides?
Yeah, because
Do you do it, Patty, do you do it to increase the pesticide use?
No.
Would you think of any breeder that would breed any crop to increase the use of pesticides?
What about Roundup resistance as we jump into GMOs?
Roundup, we're going to get to it. And yes, I saw a hand.
It seems in a lot of minds that plant breeding, as has been traditionally done, is something that could possibly occur in nature. But when you get to the point of transposing genes from one species to another, or things that could never happen by natural selection or by selective breeding, it seems to open up a whole new level of frightening and potentially harmful stuff that people say, oh, we can control this, but perhaps that's overly optimistic.
Were you peeking at my presentation? I'm just... Okay, so let's talk about this. And let's talk about the very basic constituents of us, every other animal, and plants. Mitochondria or chloroplasts. Mitochondria are essential organelles, part of our every cell, and there are hundreds of them in each cell, and they regulate respiration, basically energy. We would not be here, nor would our ancestors be here, or would any organism that is multicellular be here, were it not for those handy-dandy bacteria being incorporated with their genomes, with their own DNA, into cells. Those came from a totally different kingdom. They're bacteria, entire bacteria with their entire DNA. So they happen to be maternally transmitted. So I carry my mother's mitochondria. Plant A carries its mother's mitochondria. The nucleus is what is split equally between the paternal and maternal lines. Similarly, no plant would exist, nor would it be photosynthesizing, have chlorophyll, look green, were it not for chloroplasts. They're also bacteria, cyanobacteria. The ocean looks green because bacteria that produce chlorophyll are multiplying, and they are also integral parts of plant cells. Another naturally occurring phenomenon, which I would not be surprised if many of you have seen it, those growths, both at the crown area and the top of this tomato plant, are known as crown gall. And this is a bacterium known as Agrobacterium tumefaciens, and we have a cartoon here. This bacterium attaches to the plant, sends over a circular DNA, making the plant produce food for itself. The reason why we have those galls is because it's a smart bacterium. It wants to pump the production of the plant cells, so it puts in auxins. So it is forcing the plant to grow larger cells. It's also forcing it to produce more food for that bacterium. And this has little to do with humans. This predates humans by millions, if not hundreds of millions of years. And this is the most common mechanism used to do transformations on plants. So for the people who love Monsanto and all those other companies, that would be one of the most common ways to do it. Yes?
It seems to me that all the science you're going into, the logical extension or conclusion from this seems to me to be that we should just assume that the companies, the scientists doing genetic modification are doing the best they can for all of us. It's harmless to us, and there's no need to know whether our foods are genetically modified or not.
The question is that I'm alluding to the fact that everything is safe, and that's how it should be, and companies are looking at our best interest. I would contend that companies are looking at their own best interest. I would contend that companies are using any way to get more money because their shareholders demand money. They don't get paid in corn and soybean seed, they get paid in dollars. And if they can create a market share for themselves against their competitors, they're going to go ahead and do it. I am not trying to advocate that we should all be eating GMOs, nor am I advocating against it. All I'm trying to say is that genetic modifications do happen in nature. Are we doing it more frequently than is naturally occurring? Absolutely. Are we doing it more deliberately? Absolutely. And for me, the way I see things is that we should separate what is good for Monsanto from what is good for us. Monsanto, and the reason why they come up is that they tried to push for their product, which happens to be Roundup. Monsanto used to be a single product company until in the late 60s they figured out that by the mid-1980s they were going to lose the patent on their single product, Roundup again. And they figured out that around the same time that there's something called molecular biology and genetic modifications, and they were the first company to invest very heavily in it, discovering ways to do it more effectively, expressing it in plants, and then came around and pushed it on you, me, and everybody else. So that hegemony of the Monsanto that used to be a rinky-dinky small company that has become by far the largest seed company in the world, dwarfs anybody else, and bought out God knows how many competitors in the meantime. So we should separate the two. The science from the marketing, the lobbying, the suing, and everything else they did. Science is what I'm describing. Their policies to give their shareholders a dividend that would keep them engaged, that would give that company a market share that would be predominant. I beg your pardon?
That kind of motivation is killing us as a
Well, not all of us are altruistic. And many of us like to invest in those companies and they couldn't care less, even if it is to build a highway over our houses.
We got that.
Or, yeah. So, and that's how it works. At the same time, Roundup is one of the least environmentally harmful herbicides out there. It gets broken down in the soil within days of its use. All right, so are we playing God? We are doing quite a bit more modifications than actually happens in nature. A typical example is this golden rice. This golden rice was developed by a Swiss company with the help of the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. One of the major issues in Southeast Asia is the ability of people to consume carotene. Therefore, millions of children go blind every single year because they're not getting their vitamin A precursor, which is carotene. So what they did was to genetically modify and overexpress a gene for carotene in rice, hence the color that is golden. That company gets no royalty, nor do they make any money off of it. The International Rice Research Institute does not make any profit on multiplying and breeding for improved productivity and pest resistance from the seed. The papaya production in Hawaii was wiped out at 2 different occasions on 2 different islands in the 20th century by papaya ring spot potty virus. This is a plant affected by the virus. This is a plant that is healthy from the virus. This is a field in Hawaii, plants that are afflicted, plants that are healthy. A scientist from Cornell University by the name of Dennis Gonzalez developed a genetically modified papaya ring spot resistant papaya. They can produce papaya in Hawaii and sell it all over the world, making a net benefit to the island of Hawaii, the largest island, of $32 million every year. Papaya happens to be an essential source of food in many Southeast Asian countries, and by developing and but providing for free that technology, farmers in Southeast Asia are able to produce that crop. And by the way, Monsanto, going back to that lovely company, has sued Dennis Gonzalez and Cornell University because they infringed on a technology that that company had patented. Now we go into BT corn, soybean, and cotton. BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a bacterium that produces an insecticide. And organic farmers know it real well because they spray it on their plants. It is most effective against lepidopterans, i.e. moths and butterflies, and whatever their forms. And nymph and caterpillar, they're quite lethal. Now, what many companies, including Monsanto, Bayer, and you name your favorite company or whichever one you have stocks in, they have genetically modified corn, soybean, and cotton to inherently produce the insecticide that is produced by Bacillus thuringiensis in those crops. For example, no corn can be produced in Europe because of the Western corn borer, were it not for that genetic modification. What is the alternative? Because Europe does not produce genetically modified crops. They dump pesticides. So that BT is only produced within the confines of the plant and the only effect it has is on insects that munch on that plant, as opposed to a pesticide that's spray that can affect any insect or any organism that is roaming that field or the surroundings. With that said, we do have resistance, naturally occurring resistance to BT, and we are selecting for the organisms that can survive against it. So we would have lost the insecticide, we would have lost the genetically modified crop. And we go into Roundup Ready. Roundup Ready is in corn, soybean, cotton, sugar beet, and a variety of different things. We don't produce genetically modified sugar beet in the US, but most of the cotton that we produce would have been eaten up by cotton weevil were it not for BT cotton, but also would have been overgrown by lots of weeds were it not for Roundup. I don't have stocks in it. I don't want them to spray insecticides and fungicides and herbicides, but unfortunately for them to be able to produce a crop, they have to do it. And I'd rather see them not spray it, but have it integrated in the plant. That's my only shtick.
What about people that eat the plant?
Lovely question. The only study that I know of, and it's already about 6 years old, was a Belgian study that took potato. By the way, we don't have any genetically modified potatoes on the market. They modified potatoes and looked at the proteins, the protein profile of the genetically modified and the same variety without their genetic modification. And they found that the only protein that's different is the one that's produced by that stretch of the DNA that they included. Now, does that mean that it's the healthiest thing? Does that mean that it does not have side effects? I cannot say that. Nonetheless, we need lots of studies. There seems to be less impact on humans than there is on wild relatives of certain crops. Many of us have heard of pollen flying and pollinating wild plants, but thus far there have been no evidence, and it doesn't mean that there isn't any impact on humans from the consumption of genetically modified organisms. I can guarantee you that the shirt I'm wearing comes from genetically modified corn, and I can guarantee you I've imbibed as much soybean and corn that is modified. Does that mean I'm healthy? I don't know. We need more research. We definitely need a lot of it. This far, I couldn't find, and I researched it just before I came last night. I couldn't find anything that clearly scientifically says this way or this other way. Yes?
I have a question about bees, pollinators, so important to agriculture. There's a huge decline in bees. And I've heard from some sources that it's related to insecticides. Some talk about genetic modification. What is the best information you have about the causes of the decline in bees, and is there any solution?
Thus far, the two indicators are that we have relatively reliable evidence for our neonicotinoid insecticides, very commonly used, relatively harmless to humans, obviously, not to every other creature. Bees are the ones that are economically important. This is why we give them some importance. Moreover, there's the virus that has spread around honeybee hives, and that seems to be also a leading cause of deaths in North America. Viruses are very common in honeybee production. It seems that a particular virus hitched its way on Varroa mites and has spread across millions of honeybee hives across North America. And yes, it's about $4 billion every year of loss because of them, and it's likely to increase if we don't pick up in our population. Just briefly, agriculture is about the future. Fuels, building material, pharmaceuticals, land reclamation, increased nutrients, employment in agriculture, but also in other industries that support agriculture. And agritourism is a growing business. Anyway, this is my presentation. Again, I don't mean it to be in support of any particular group. I mean it as an enlightenment, and I apologize if some of what I said could be taken one way or the other.
I want to thank Dr. Atallah, and I want to invite, if he's willing, those of you who want to continue this question and answer to stay, but some of us do have to leave. Our programs usually end well before this, so if that's okay,
absolutely,
we will
I'm here.
Stay if you want to talk further with him. Some of us do have to leave.